hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the hybrid. So, for a long time in cannabis regulation, data was treated like a box to check. Stand up a track and trace system, collect the information, store it somewhere, and move on. The assumption was that simply having the data meant the system was working. We now know that simply doesn't cut it. Today, cannabis regulators aren't short on data, they're buried in it. Millions of transactions, plant movements, transfers, sales, tax reports, lab results. And that reality creates a new kind of risk. Once an agency has that data, it carries a responsibility. If the data is simply sitting there unused, unanalyzed, and not informing decisions, it stops becoming an asset and starts becoming a liability. Track and trace systems were never designed to answer the hardest question regulators face. They record activity, but they don't explain behavior. They don't tell you where the risk is building, where tax revenue may be leaking, or where enforcement resources should actually be focused. That's where the analytics come in. Analytics is the difference between knowing what happened and understanding what it means and how best to respond. And it doesn't just matter for regulators. Good analytics matters for tax agencies trying to ensure revenue is being reported and collected accurately. They matter for financial institutions trying to manage cannabis-related risk. They matter for policymakers making tough decisions and assessing whether legalization had delivered on the promises that were made to the public. So today's conversation is about operationalizing data, not just collecting that information, but actually using it. And about how analytics can help deliver on the promises that were made during the legalization debate. Our guest today is Adam Crabtree, founder and CEO of NCS Analytics, based in Denver. Adam launched NCS with the idea that data should support real-time decision-making, not just reporting after the fact. Today, his team monitors more than 18,000 cannabis businesses nationwide, working with both cannabis regulators and financial institutions to identify risk and bring clarity to some of the most complex parts of the cannabis market. So before we bring Adam in, naturally, we always go over to my lovely co-host, Shawn Collins. How you doing, Shawn?
I'm lovely. Thanks for asking. Good to see you.
Yeah. Good to see you. I know we talk about data all the time on this podcast. We talk about data off this podcast. Certainly one of my favorite topics to talk about. So psyched that Adam is here. I think he's really at the forefront of this conversation, has been for a long time with this company NCS and the work that they do with cannabis regulators. So Adam, thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us a little bit of time, and thank you for sharing with our listeners the work that you're doing. So if you could, starting right off, just for our listeners and for Shawn, just give us a little bit about your background, where you came from, how you got to NCS, anything that you think may be helpful to inform this conversation.
Within reason, right? Like we don't need the full, keep it relevant, I guess.
Don't worry, none of the pre-NCS is relevant. No, thank you guys for having me. This should be a lot of fun. So I'm a recovering banker. I spent the better part of a decade here in Denver managing banks, big banks, small banks, etc. And as most bankers, I was a greedy one, managed to a balance sheet. So I was trying to figure out how to get part of Colorado's billion-odd dollars in sales onto mine. So I've got a background in math, and I started trying to figure out ways that I could get my compliance folks comfortable with taking cannabis-related deposits. At that point in time, it was really, really new. I mean, NCS celebrated 10 years in September. And so back then, it was just mainly Colorado and Washington. There wasn't a ton in the way of how it was working, how it should be doing. I'm sure you guys remember the FinCEN guidance, the whopping 8 pages that banks were supposed to have to get comfortable in how to correctly do this with little else. And so the whole thought was, how can we use the data to show that what's being deposited is what should be being deposited, not just a simple match, but going beyond that, does it make sense? Is it defensible? What data do we have out there? And so started playing with different ways to bend the data, do those validations, do it in a timely manner, because that's the big one in banking. You don't want cash that shouldn't be there sitting there for any longer than it should be. One thing led to another. I got thrown in front of the governor's office here, and was working through some stuff, showing them some of the early work we were doing. And they posed the question, if banks can get to this level of detail, why can't the government use it? Honestly, wasn't a use case I'd thought of when we were first looking at launching. So kind of took that home, unpacked it, and realized there was an underserved need in both the governmental space and the financial space. Didn't realize at the time that those are also the two hardest spaces to launch a startup into. Yeah, came back, and that's where NCS was started. So that was a little over 10 years ago, and just been growing ever since.
That government use case, because I think the data makes a lot of sense for banks as far as their obligations, their reporting requirements. But in that initial conversation with Colorado, and I'm sure subsequent conversations since, what is the, like, why should government care? What is the, like, we have, like, Erik and I have talked about data a lot. We both pursued open data strategies to varying degrees of success, and obviously we're continuing to hone that across the country. But why does government, what's the point?
So it's actually kind of a funny story that answers your question at the same time. It was my first meeting with Andrew Friedman. He was the czar at the time. About halfway through my presentation, I'm thinking to myself how well it's going, how engaged this guy is. And I get to a slide where we had found 3 different locations under the same company that their activity was statistically impossible. They were in different parts of the metro area, yet they were almost a perfect match. They were like a 90% match. So you would see an activity in one, and the other 2 would have a mirrored activity, just a percentage change. So I get to that slide, and I'm talking through it, and he goes, wait, what? And so I walk him through that again. He's like, I'm really sorry. I haven't been paying attention. Can you start over? Which was, a bit of a blow to the ego, but it was, at that time, it wasn't really understood how much data could be used, because if you looked at those businesses separately, they were flawless. There wasn't a penny, a seed, nothing out of place. It wasn't until you put them in context and ran them through analytics that you're like, these are completely manipulated numbers. Later on, that business no longer has licenses, and there were some fun court cases about it. But there just wasn't an understanding of how data can be used, and carrying that forward, even though we're starting to see a pretty substantial shift in wanting to use that data, being able to leverage it efficiently and effectively is still a pretty big challenge. There's a lot that you can find in the data that, yes, you might stumble upon, you might get a tip, something like that, but not near the scale or efficiency of actually leveraging the data at their fingertips.
So I think it's important to set a baseline here for the conversation. I think obviously I know how the NCS analytic platform works for your government clients. I think Shawn is well aware on how it works. Can you just give the listeners a little deeper understanding of how it interacts with the other systems that cannabis regulators use, and what value it brings to them? Why would a state agency actually bring in an NCS analytics? Excuse me.
Sure. So as you mentioned, we monitor somewhere around 18,000 licensees. Depending on the week, we ingest somewhere between 80 and 100 million data points. It's all run backwards, forwards, upside down, and sideways through predictive and behavioral analytics. I actually hold the patents, the mathematical patents on the predictive analytics, to where we're able to very quickly isolate out the behaviors that are unwanted. And unwanted is very market specific. Obviously, there's large overlap, but then you get into individual states. But being able to take all of that data and very quickly find where your attention is needed most. So we can boil down most of the anomalies to a few things. You don't know how to use the system, you're not using it correctly, or you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. All 3 of those are attention worthy, but being able to find them, see how severe they are, and react to it while it's still occurring, or while it's possible to be stopped, mitigated, etc., is the difference and why it's needed. So whether it's being able to very quickly isolate out what needs to be recalled, whether it's finding testing that's been manipulated, whether it's finding tax leakage, any of those things, being able to use the very limited resources governments have at their full efficiency. So instead of, doing audits on 1,000 licensees, why don't you do them on the 10 that are most likely to be doing whatever behavior you're trying to stop or that is most concerning to you? So yes, you would get possibly get lucky on those 1,000, or you could do very targeted efforts that actually have a meaningful impact.
And I'm sorry, Shawn, but I think
Let's go ahead.
that's the point. I think it ties it in real nicely to my opening monologue, which was wonderfully delivered, if I do say so
Flawlessly
myself. Yeah,
executed,
yeah. But yeah, that's the point. Like, we've seen when Shawn and I came in and we were told by our legislatures, you need to have a track and trace system. Like, literally just setting it up and having it was a huge success. But 10 years later, that's not the case anymore. We're seeing states that have been given the same direction. They have a track and trace system that's up and running, yet now it's actually becoming a liability to have that data and not taking action on it to deliver the integrity or oversight that all stakeholders expect out of them. So the analytics engine, which you're talking about, and now you can tell I'm getting a little excited the way my pitch is picked up here, is exactly that. Like, all right, you have this data. Now, instead of just doing these one-off investigations within your metrics or your BioTracks or your whatever it may be, we can run it all at the same time and basically point a big red flag or a blinking arrow, show you where you should be looking to make something actionable, which I just find so fascinating, especially with all of the challenges that these agencies still face, even 10 years later, when you're talking about, and you, Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong though. And like, they're still wrestling with inversion. They're still wrestling with diversion. They're still wrestling with nefarious testing. I'll use that as a nice word. Like, it makes a lot of sense to me when we're talking about, you have this treasure trove of data. Having it is not just enough. We actually need to be using it. What's the best way to use it? Is some types of analytic engine. And the other point, that there's no real question baked into this. I think it's fascinating that this was all born from banking. And then you're like, oh, you know what? There's a need for it in banking, but there is also the need. And you're probably way ahead of the curve. I would like to hear, like, I guess here's the question for you, so I can stop my rambling. I apologize. Is early on, were states receptive to it? Did they want to know? Did they want to look behind the curtain and understand everything that was happening? Were they as eager to start like nipping some of this stuff in the bud that NCS Analytics, the platform, could help them address? Or were some states more hesitant, or were you just kind of early?
We were definitely early. And, with any new technology, there's the whole crossing the chasm thing. So we were definitely early. I also think we have to remember back, 2015, 2018, all of that, data analytics was still emerging even in private industry. And so it wasn't something that was common. We often joke that early on we were accused of black magic, being able to very quickly say, this isn't happening. They're not doing this. They are diverting the product. Here it is. And regulators looking and being like, how do you know? How are you actually making that conclusion, and trying to walk them through it? Because we were not only trying to help them understand how their data could be used, but data analytics, advanced analytics, machine learning, neural nets, all of that kind of fun stuff long before those were all the buzzwords that they are today. So there was a lot of skepticism. There was also, you guys were part of that first class of regulators, but I'm sure you remember even before you, a lot of the early regulators were former boots on the ground law enforcement, things like that wanted to touch it, wanted to walk in and see it. They weren't necessarily interested in some nerd and his data. So that was definitely an education and shift we had to do a lot of.
That's probably why Shawn and I were so interested in the data piece, the transparency piece, the analytics piece. We weren't ex-law enforcement. We were the guys that sat at the desk and yeah, anyway,
Well,
sorry.
I think to that point though, Eric, we were looking for that efficiency and credibility too. So I'll be honest, I looked at the data that we were collecting, and it kind of makes your head spin sometimes where you've got licensing information. And I think, Adam, to your point, we were looking at what are our enforcement priorities? What is our culture here? What are the things that we are going to be monitoring, that we're going to be aggressive about, whether it's behavior we need to curb, get ahead of? Is there something we're hearing about? Is sort of a drumbeat on the ground of this is happening, everybody knows it's happening, why aren't you doing something about it? But also as a brand new agency that didn't exist before, and not having been that sort of boots on the ground law enforcement, I think our my vision at least was, I'm coming in with all of the historic baggage of government, of there's an opaqueness to how they run their business. There's not a lot of credibility as it pertains to some of the work we were trying to do in communities around social equity. And so part of our data effort was to prove it, to say, look, don't take my word for it. Here's the information. But the risk I ran into is like, that just becomes like, if you're looking for that needle in the haystack, we're just publishing the haystack and saying like, go nuts, have at it. And maybe you'll find it before we do. And if you do, throw a flare up and we'll come running. But I think what you've done is layered on that intelligence aspect to say, give us all the haystacks, give us the licensing portal, give us the metric seed to sale information. Any information you collect, to your point, can be layered in. But I guess I'm wondering, outside of those two things, that licensing, if you have a database or a portal or some sort of interactive repository, and say your seed to sale tracking, what other data is out there for a regulator to lean into or to gather that can become relevant? Because one of the things I actually hold, and I've talked about it a lot on this podcast, has been the burden of a regulator is not just to know something, but you've got to prove it. And that proving aspect can sometimes be the most difficult because, yeah, I can run with rumor, I can run with innuendo, but I can't go to court with it. I can't take someone's property with it. And so as much as you and I may know something, that burden of proving it, I guess, so back to the question of, is there other data that's sitting out there that, whether there's regulators listening or even just operators that are saying, like, frankly, what tools are regulators leveraging to find my perfect, pristine data, the data, like you said, these guys were operating perfectly. It's just the little thing that we sort of layered on top that said, something suspicious here.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously tracking data, there's tax records, there's bank accounts, there's the socioeconomic, the demographic. I mean, some of our markets, we have the ability to tap power meters and things like that, to where,
That's not creepy at all.
no, I mean, we're not even getting into the really creepy things we can do because I can't talk about those on here. But it's not only those sources independently, but it's how they interact with one another. And so when we talk about a retailer, let's just say it's doing X, Y, and Z, everything looks perfect, but then even contextualizing it with the market they serve, there are such strong markers in what a retailer will carry, will sell, all of those based on the market it serves, that we've had ones that were like, this looks really strange. They shouldn't be moving this type of product in this volume, X, Y, and Z, and things like that, to where I think what's difficult, and what makes my job fun, is you can find a ton from one data source, but if you start adding in others and looking at that same event from different perspectives, it's truly phenomenal in what you can see. It's just like when, if we're going back to the boots on the ground analogy, an event happens and you ask 10 people what they saw, and you're going to get slightly different versions of that event. We do that with the data. So that same whatever event, we can look at it from a bunch of different angles and say, okay, this actually checks out when you look at it through this. But when you look at it through this lens, you're starting to see something else. You're starting to see something you want to dig deeper into. And to your point about knowing versus actually knowing, I think early on we were more of an indicator, a bird dog of sorts of, hey, I'm seeing something odd here. You should prioritize them. But now it's getting to the point where we're able to push it a lot further. And we go through a lot of third-party very difficult and expensive validations where we bring in these companies that fully rebuild our analytics and attest to the fact that they are not only doing what I tell you they're doing, but to a statistically near perfect level, all of those things to where they can be used in court. They can be used for that further push. And so we've had to grow up a lot in that respect as well, because you couldn't just go knock on Erik's door because you had a gut feeling. Well, maybe you could, depending on your
Yeah,
rules.
you could in Maine.
I mean, yeah. So being able to actually push it to the level where you can take those more serious steps and things like that has been something that we've had to be able to get to that level of certainty for the regulators and for our financial institutions. If you're pulling someone's bank account, you can always do it because that's how the account agreements work, but you better be pretty dang sure of why you're doing it and are you doing it for the right reasons.
I mean, that's the way that I always thought of it, right? Like, you have an analytics engine like this to help suss through your track and trace data, not to be like, oh, we found this in NCS analytics, your license is getting revoked. It's a piece that it's a piece that goes into the entirety of the equation. In a more efficient way, helps you determine, all right, there's a higher likelihood that something nefarious is happening here, or a behavior needs to be fixed. It gives me a higher confidence, and then you go out and complete the compliance or enforcement process. You show up, you ask your questions, and either you find something or you don't. I think it's the efficiency piece and the higher level of confidence, just to help make your operations run a little bit better. That's the way that I've always thought about it, but I understand what you're saying.
I would maybe throw into that too the objectivity of it as well, which is
Yes.
one of the things that we get. This goes back to the law enforcement, maybe comparison or history or spirit, especially in the cannabis space, is the lack of objectivity sometimes in enforcement, or that frankly that subjective feeling of these guys will knock it off my back, like that I'm being targeted by this. And in reality, I think I've always held like these things are tools. They are tools to be used. They are tools to be relied upon. But at the end of the day, like the burden on government is still to act in good faith and with some level of again, prove it or don't. And we're bringing, I shouldn't say I didn't bring a lot of cases, but a lot of our work was sort of months long ordeals of going deep dives to prove the thing we know. But we've also got to check ourselves on bias there sometimes to say, like, are we digging so deep to find something, or are we digging to look for a specific thing? But I think to your point, Erik, the efficiency of if I've got 1,000 licensees, and Adam, you mentioned it too, like I don't have the ability to audit all of them. So can I bring some intelligence that says, and I'll give you a perfect example, a sort of a live example that I was dealing with when I was on my way out of the commission in Mass was we have this theory or this philosophy or this regulatory ability to relegate someone's cultivation tier based on sales. If they didn't move, I think it was 70 or 75% of their inventory, they could be reduced down a tier. And the sort of the criticism or the push from the industry at the time was, why aren't you using this tool? And of course, my first reaction was because it's going to, in my opinion, which is, I should probably disclaim that, it's going to inadvertently and disproportionately harm a smaller grow that isn't tied to a manufacturing license because they can't just move their inventory and metric to production. And so my fear is that there won't be sort of an even-handed approach to enforcement, but it's also who's going to be the first one that I choose? Because that's like you drew the shortest straw of all the straws, and now I'm going to potentially reduce your license tier. But I wonder, maybe the way to handle that is to layer data on it and say, we've evaluated it. Here's sort of the top 10 that we're going to now look at. But it's almost like that at least takes the human subjectivity and risk of bias out of it potentially. So long though as your data itself is objective and complete and all those things. But I think that's where, Adam, I think you sort of touched upon the lengths you go to ensure that is a reliable data set and that the results are sort of here's the production that we came up with.
Yeah, audit selection, I think is probably one of the use cases that is talked about least, but at the end of the day, math is math. So You sit down, you discuss what your priorities are. You have an analytics system that is driven to hit those. And then as long as you go by the results and you're consistent with it, that alleviates a lot of the, oh, he's picking on me, things like that. Now, you could go build the fuck Shawn Collins analytics system where no matter what
Yeah.
you do, you
I think
always
that's
show
what
up
Maine
on.
calls it. Yeah.
Dumped a lot of money into that system.
I think there's a lot of folks with that system. Yeah.
You could build that system. So no matter what you do, you always show up on top. But that's where the third-party validations and things like that come into play. So if you have to walk into court and you hand the judge the stack of, here's all the external validation, here's how it is, and this person is continuously showing up on the top of the list, I'd love to stop driving to their facility, but we can't. Based on what they're reporting, based on what we're seeing, we are bound by our responsibility as a regulator to continue to do this. So that it gives an additional layer of defensibility to, it's not a personal thing, it's not a bias, it's not you've got an annoyed neighbor that's calling in a complaint every 15 minutes, things like that. It changes the ability to target on the actual behaviors and move it out of that personal side of things.
So transition the conversation just a little bit here. And I'll start by saying I've never been or would be too critical of cannabis regulators, understanding the environment in which they're working. They all have different priorities, resources. But as far as your experience, Adam, in working with these state agencies, because you work in several states, but also the ones that you interact with where they're not formal clients, where do you see cannabis agencies and regulators falling short with the work that they're doing with data, the consistency on how they're using the data, or even the quality of the data that they're bringing in? Are
And
there
definitely name states too. Like,
yeah,
name them.
let's throw them under the bus. They'll love
Yeah.
it. We'll get some listeners in those states.
No, I mean, that was a lot of questions all at once. I think, you guys know your biggest challenge is you have so much thrown at you all at once, whether it's your stakeholders, whether it's your elected officials, whether it's all of those. And so finding the ability to prioritize what is actually impactful versus what you're being told to chase after, all of those kind of things. And so I think that doing a deep push into data, whether it's bringing someone in, whether it's building out a team, whatever it might be, is very easy to get deprioritized because it's not going to be an instant. If you're building out your own program, things like that, it's going to take time to get comfortable, to understand, to build the SOPs and the operations around it, that when you have things that are very right now on fire, that's where your attention goes. And so you end up chasing other things because that's the direction you're given or what you need or told you need to be doing right now. And so I would say that it's an investment, whether it's time or money or frankly both, that you don't necessarily have the ability to make at this given time. I also think that there's a number of folks that sit in your chair that have PTSD from tech projects. I'm sure you both have examples of they can be the most miserable thing in existence. They spiral out of control. They go on forever. They don't work right. And then no matter what you're laying out, the public is seeing one thing. And so there's also, I don't want any more tech than I absolutely have to deal with. So I think it's both a little bit.
That the tech piece is particularly interesting as far as the legacy and the reputation of government and bureaucracy is that these things turn into boondoggles that never get delivered on time, underperform, all those. There is some definite PTSD from again, just broad stroke government there. But I also wonder, just recalling my own perspective, I was building everything on the fly in the back of my mind thinking like, this is all going to have to talk to each other at some point. Will it? And it's like, well, that's a tomorrow problem. And I'm worried about yesterday's problem still, not even today's. So like, I've got to just get this done, roll it out, meet expectations. The challenge, of course, is that then you blink, you wake up and it's like, all right, I've got all these different compartmentalized systems. with varying degrees of access to them too, from a security standpoint of, the licensing team is not investigators, so they shouldn't be seeing some of this information. Commissioners should have access to all the information, but with some visibility controls around firewalls, that sort of thing. And so now I've got all these data sets, these subsets of data sets. We had stuff in Excel spreadsheets. We had it was just a rat's nest of information. But what I think the value of, and I guess part of it's commercial here for NCS, but is your ability to pull in other data sets unrelated to, say, Massachusetts, right? Like you could have this aggregate data from across the country around the intelligence aspect of this type of, like you said earlier, this type of license should not and cannot, like it is statistically impossible for them to do that. I wouldn't have that information intuitively necessarily, like unless I had some season to my experience. But I think that's also the benefit of there's this temptation to build it and house it internally. Like this is our proprietary database and we're going to guard it with our lives. But there's a lot of value in bringing in something you can kind of layer on top of all of your data that then incorporates, again, the treasure trove that you've got access to. So how does, from I guess not a sales pitch standpoint, but do you get that sense that regulators are somewhat protective of data too, and sort of hesitant to relinquish either whether it be access and or permission for it?
Yeah, I mean, well, it kind of segues into a lot of what you talked about. The old adage in tech is no one gets fired for buying IBM. And now you could probably change that to like Google or something like that. But the whole theory was that if everyone does the status quo, then if something goes wrong, it's not on you. And so I think there is the hesitancy. It's declining, that hesitancy, but there's still the hesitancy to really go out on a limb and try something new, because if it doesn't work, it's on you. And so keeping that status quo, building your little fiefdom around that, not going outside of it. There is a comfort. That's how it's always been done. There is also, let's be clear, that data is, depending on your market, that's a lot of personal data. That's a lot of private, proprietary things like that of these businesses that they don't want shared. So there is that understanding. And to be clear, I've never made a single dollar off of selling data. So while our models are informed by our entire data set, I can't let you tap into another state's data. But we can say that for an indoor cultivator, this type of lights, all of this kind of stuff, here's what we would expect. And so especially for markets that are going through a change or markets coming online, being able to jumpstart those expectations and really get ahead of that, it's tremendous value to them.
Adam, a couple questions ago, you started getting at a piece that I wanted to talk about too. Just to better understand, all right, we have the NCS platform. It sits on top of track and trace. In the background, it runs analytics and brings value to these cannabis agencies. But you had said, one of the barriers is, you need to develop these SOPs, and how do we incorporate it? How do your state clients, or how do you talk to other states about, this is how you operationalize NCS? This is how I would recommend you incorporate it into your day-to-day, your week-to-week, month-to-month, in order to extract the maximum amount of value out of the analytics engine as possible. Like how do they actually do that?
Well, and it kind of goes a little bit back to the audit selection, things like that, but it typically starts at the executive level, whether just the director or their team as well. But it's, I think, probably the best way to communicate the will of the agency at a top down, because since we've built everything and it's all done in-house, we're able to adapt what your priorities are, how they show up in the alerts and things like that. So it allows that executive leadership to set the priorities. Therefore, that flows down to the actual enforcement teams and things like that would be in it, to where what they're seeing is the priority set by that director. So it actually creates a very effective communication of, this is what I want you to target. This is why it's showing up as the highest tier events, things like that. And when you see that, here is what we want you to do, whether it's the single score risk indexing stuff, which we'll talk about, that we developed, or whether it's the individuals. Every time you see a tier 5, our most serious alert, of this behavior, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, to where it allows them to very clearly pass on their priorities in an efficient manner. And then the fact that you can see if it's done or not, that you can see, are people going in? Are they looking at this? Are they now dispositioning these? Because we've added in the ability to say, yep, I looked at it, here's the feedback, things like that. And so I actually think when properly constructed, it can be an incredibly effective tool to ensure that the leadership's priorities are carried out through the entire agency.
To that end, and I want to open the door a bit more into the tier system, because I think that's a fascinating tool for regulators, but also for industry to understand a bit too, is because I realize, like, we're all kind of in this together in a way. Like, good operators want enforcement, and obviously regulators are, that's their job, that's our function, is enforcement. But I used to say to our staff all the time that it's enforcement through education as well, because while ignorance is not a defense to a law, there can be ignorance, and that also is a two-way street. We are learning alongside industry sometimes. But to that end, as far as the top-down culture or priorities, one of the things we would also try to do a lot is kind of mix that up every once in a while as well. Part of it was obviously to keep people on their toes, but also I think respects the vast array of regulations that operators must comply with. And so it's one of those things, if you're only looking at youth access and you're not looking at diversion or inversion, well, then what's going to happen on your watch? Diversion and inversion is going to happen because you're not looking for it. And so I would put a season to things or randomize some things and say, for the next month, let's take a look at this. Or I'm hearing a lot of noise about this. Do you find in working with regulators, especially, that kind of becomes like, we're hearing a lot of rumors about X. Can you help us figure that out? Like, are you patching some of that enforcement effort, or are you helping them develop the cadence of it sometimes too?
Both. And so I think because I agree, it can't all be heavy-handed enforcement. We're rolling in and taking your license. So we will see agencies that will pick something fairly innocuous that we know you're not doing. You don't realize that's how it's showing up in the data, and really prioritizing that. An easy one for retailers is negative inventory. I know that you don't have negative inventory, but here's how it's showing up in the data. You sold 10,000 vape carts you don't have. Realistically, what it is your point of sale system is not actually communicating this. Do you realize this is what's showing? So things like that, where we're picking things that look bad, we don't think that's actually going on, and it's our chance to build a rapport with the operator. Instead of rolling in heavy and seizing everything, being like, hey, let me guess, this is your point of sale operator, and watching them be like, how'd you know? Well, because you're one of 50 that we've seen in the last month that has this issue. Just so you know, it looks like you're selling a bunch of product you bought somewhere else. We know that's not the case. Let us help you. So it certainly can be that tool to build that rapport, especially if you're picking things that we don't actually think are happening, that do not present that public health and safety risk, because I'm not saying you should compromise that. It can also act as that proverbial empty squad car that they like to throw out on the highway that hasn't had a cop in it for a month, but you see it, you slow down. And so being able to be like, hey, Erik, I noticed you did this yesterday. Them being like, oh, wait, what? You saw it? What? Oh, how? And having that reaction, we've actually seen has a very powerful impact. And it's kind of fun to watch, where we'll target a behavior or an alert or whatever you want to call it for a period of time and watch it drop off, watch that behavior start to go away. And it actually not only helps the industry, it helps build that rapport, but it's also kind of fun to look at how you can shape these industries.
Change the behavior. That's so funny too. It's, and not only is it like changing the behaviors the way that they should be behaving anyway, but it's like, we always talk about bad data in, bad data out. So you can use it as a mechanism or tool to help shape behaviors to where they're using the system the way that it's supposed to be used. So you have data that's accurate and actionable. And that's just funny.
That felt like a constant caveat that I would have to put out around our, especially open data, was like, this is reported information.
Exactly.
This has not been verified. I've not done the math on this. Like, please, it should be accurate, but it's also not my responsibility to put the data in. Therefore, look, you want access to this, go nuts. But And then it would be like, how is it possible to have negative inventory? It's like, yeah, like you said, Adam, it's not, they don't have negative inventory, but, or the other sort of the things, you can't add weight after harvest, all that. Like there's a lot of things that are out there sort of that are just data anomalies, but also could be evidence of something. And stupidity is sometimes one of them. But I guess back to something you mentioned earlier, because I want to learn more about how you calculate that risk, et cetera. Is you mentioned the tier system, like a tier 5 is you're high risk and pay attention. Can you unpack that a bit for us and our listeners as far as what is that metric? How does someone end up on a tier, and what does it mean? And that sort of how is that information used both through NCS, but for states that are looking to target feels like the wrong way to describe it, but looking to explore how someone can end up there.
So we've got two systems. There's the individual flagging system, which is thousands of different permutations of alerts at this point, and those are all scored a 1 through 5. 1 is your lowest priority. Hey, this is going on. Probably not out of bounds, but you may not love it. So keep an eye on it if it becomes a habit, all the way up to a tier 5, which is there needs to be human eyes on this now. And how those go is financial impact, the severity of the event, so how wide scale this is, how much weight are we talking, things like that. There's also a regulator preference that comes into play where something may not necessarily be that big of a deal, but it's a pet peeve or it's a priority of the executive director, so those tiers can be elevated. So it's a combination of the potential impact, if this is actually what's going on, how serious, what's the impact to the market, public health and safety, all of that kind of stuff, all the way to, if we're looking at financial events, how big's the dollar amount, because nothing's going to irritate you more if I'm having you chase quarters all day long. Or the black and white, this is out of bounds. And so every time it happens, it automatically needs to be a tier 5. And so that customizability also allows the states to tune it to their needs, because we all know of regulations that you're like, that doesn't make a ton of sense. That's great. That's for somebody else to deal with. Our job is to tell you it's happening. It's your job to enforce it and things like that, especially if it's legislature set rules or things like that, where, I mean, how many times did you guys revise your rules where something sounded great in practice, you started doing, and you're like, we need to tweak this, we need to rewrite it, things like that.
Well, you mentioned PTSD. I might have it over rulemaking and that
Shawn,
process of drafting.
Shawn made a lot of mistakes in his rule.
Improvements. Shawn made a lot of improvements to the program. Yeah.
Improvements.
Thanks for the opening to clarify that.
So, Adam, all right. So you were just talking about the financial piece, the money piece being an indicator on how big a tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which brought my brain to different use cases for NCS and the analytics. There has to be a use case for different agencies that touch cannabis with NCS analytics, since it's on top of the tracking system. And my brain goes towards departments of revenue, treasury, because we all know that there is a significant tax gap in what should be collected and what's actually collected specific to cannabis. I mean, I think that's the case for most industries, but it may be even larger in cannabis for a bunch of different reasons. So is there a use case, because you have a lot of that self-reported data around that stuff, which I would think that an auditor or somebody in a department of revenue who's trying to make sure that they're collecting the appropriate amount of money, there would be some value in that. Am I thinking about this right?
Well, there certainly is, because, so as far as the tax gap, the last IRS study I saw, it was 17% across all business types. That's the tax gap due to underreporting. Cash intensive industries, it goes up. Plain and simple, the less counter data points you have, the easier it is to fail to disclose revenue. You could tell me you have $20 in your pocket, short of reaching your pocket. I have absolutely no way of telling the truth. Now, as you start adding in more electronic transactions and things like that, it gets easier to find when people are underreporting their income. But as we all know, credit cards aren't allowed in cannabis. Debit cards aren't allowed in cannabis. There's a bunch of cutesy workarounds and things like that. But generally speaking, this is a predominantly cash industry still. And so it's very easy to underreport that revenue, especially when you look at, with the burden of 280E, how high that tax rate actually is. And that's before we get into the state stuff. But 280E alone makes their effective tax rate like 60 to 70%. So strongly incentivized, very easy to underreport. It creates the perfect environment to be like, oh, no, I definitely didn't make that last week. I only sold $10 worth of product. So being able to very quickly isolate out and show the potential financial impact of that underreported sales is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, because we see that, we hear it all the time. There's consistently conversations in governors' offices and legislatures about tax rates. Do we increase it? Do we decrease it? Are we delivering on the promises made during the campaigns? All of that. So I would imagine if there's actual value here, you've had some conversations around that piece, because it seems like it could be.
Yeah, and I think those conversations are becoming more common. Tax agencies are also getting more into the analytics side of things, where you touched on it. A lot of these states made grandiose promises of how this tax revenue would be spent, whether it's roads or schools or whatever it might be. And so when that tax revenue doesn't appear as promised, that's another public one of people getting angsty about it. And then with the challenges in a number of markets with the industry, there's always the conversation about lowering taxes, which draws ire from everybody except for the industry. But I often pose the question, if you can collect all that's owed, you probably could reduce your tax rate pretty substantially and still get as much, if not more, than you're collecting right now. But the problem is, as with any aspect of this industry, you've got the people trying to do everything right, that costs them a lot more money than the people that are not, for lack of a better term. And that's on every aspect, whether it's trying to compete against the people that are buying, selling to the illicit market, to the people that aren't paying their taxes, to any of those things. And so you're creating two markets where the people trying to do it right have an entirely separate but pretty large tax placed on them, that if we could level that playing field, I think a lot of these markets would stabilize, including the ability to reduce taxes while fulfilling those promises.
I'd have to imagine too that extrapolates to any and all industries, frankly. Like the tax leak, especially cash heavy businesses, that, and not to mention like the actual fraud and like nefarious illegal activity as far as skimming and the use of technology to, so, but that's where I think cannabis is unique and not so unique, is that what's unique is that I think you have regulators at this point that are building systems and infrastructure from zero sometimes. One of the things that I was most grateful for is I didn't have legacy data to bring into a system. I could just start from scratch. But it was also this moment of, well, what if you could monitor an industry's growth from zero? And what would that look like? What tools do you wish you could have? What tools would you regret not having a year from now, 2 years from now, to then look backwards? But I think just for any cannabis operators or industry folks that are listening to this, certainly this is not a determination or a conclusion on what a tax rate should or could be. Instead, it's just how do you make that decision, and with what information, armed with what information, the accuracy of that information. But again, just to reiterate, it's not necessarily a cannabis thing as much as it is a government oversight bureaucracy thing of making sure you capture the 100% or as close to the whole as possible, but also that you track it and monitor it.
And we work in other industries. Cannabis is just our largest. So we've played in alcohol, tobacco, generalized sales suppression, all of these different industries. So no, it's not cannabis by any stretch. In fact, the patents my patents, we did it on cash intensive industries in general, because at the time, federal agencies weren't a huge fan of cannabis. But like back to restaurants, there are these very sophisticated computer programs called zappers that
Yeah.
they can completely rebuild your inventory on the fly by deleting every third transaction, but then it deletes the record of that food ever being there, all of that kind of stuff. It knows it's on cache and things like that. So no, this isn't just cannabis by any means. Cannabis gets a lot of the attention, but yeah, I mean, how many times have you walked into a bar, the bartender charges you for a beer, you watch him pocket the $5-10 and bring it in? I mean, it's the exact same thing. And so it's not just cannabis. I mean, one of the quick and dirty ways you can look at a restaurant is what's their ratio of cards to cash. Like, that is the laziest analytics you can do. And that is how a lot of audits are done. Like, oh, really? You're 90% credit cards? You're a liar. All of your neighbors are like 50-50. So why don't we talk about the rest of your revenue?
The
That's
Zapper thing is really interesting to me. Just so I wrote legislation on this in Massachusetts like 10 years ago. In the time, it was so sophisticated to me, it like kind of blew my mind, where it was you could, as the proprietor, go in and say, I want to take out $1,000 in cash. And it would take all of your cheeseburgers and turn them into hamburgers, and all of your beers and turn them into like whatever the reduction was. And then to your point, Adam, it would then update your inventory. And it was literally a software platform. And I remember I was at a NCSL, National Conference of State Legislatures event, learning about it, and came back and called our revenue folks and was like, you guys onto this thing called Zappers? And they're like, we've been looking for someone to talk to about the law around this. So also that should remind you, it's not a new phenomenon by any means. So no, I think it's an interesting, again, I feel like Erik now, like I'm excited to talk about data. So
I'm just excited for like Chili's nationwide bringing in NCS analytics.
$5 margs, yeah. What could go wrong?
So let me get Chili's CEO on the phone. Adam, so let's go to right now. We're at this interesting inflection point in cannabis, or I don't know if it's even an inflection point. It's just like an interesting time with all the things that are happening to hemp, all the things that are happening with the rescheduling process. Last week, Shawn and I recorded an episode about ballot initiatives looking to overturn legalization. There's been comments made out of the governor's office in Oklahoma. Like, it's just such an interesting time. What's going to happen with NCS? Like, what is the next 5, 10, 15 years with NCS in regards to, I guess, both with what you're doing with cannabis agencies, revenue agencies, but also on the financial institutions? How do you see yourself evolving, growing, flexibility? God, we're doing this flexing, being flexible. Like, that's just a long-winded way of, sir, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now?
So I think, and this is going to be a short tangent, but I'll get to where you're going. I think one of the most interesting things that cannabis caused from a technology perspective was when it started, all of the traditional tech companies, all of your monsters said, no, we're not going anywhere near this. And so it created this weird little ecosystem, this protected petri dish of companies like myself, like Metric, like BioTrack, like every point of sale system you can imagine, where they got to create and define a new technology without the competition that normally would have wiped them out. I mean, imagine how different this would have been if when Colorado was coming online, your Oracles, your SAPs, your Salesforce, like, yeah, we got this, don't worry about it. Like, this would be so vastly different. And so it's created this new and emerging technology where a lot of those are finding use in other places, whether they're expanding into like markets. I mean, back to the restaurants, I think Aloha and I can't even remember, Micro something have been the only systems in restaurants forever, including when I used to work in them. But now some of these point of sales are repurposing because they were able to get this foothold. There's nothing different about us. We keep getting new and interesting use cases, whether it's pushing the boundaries on the taxes, whether it's continuing to go further on what we can do on the regulatory. One of the use cases that we got asked about recently was EVs. Like, we don't think about electric vehicles for the need, but the fact that we can monitor power meters and things like that, one of the challenges that a lot of states are hitting right now is your roads are paid for by gas taxes.
Mm-hmm.
EVs don't pay gas taxes. And so the budgets to fix your roads and your highways didn't have a way to take into account the fact that gas taxes are dramatically dropping. And so is there a way that you could associate a per kilowatt hour charge just like you do for retail, just like you do for gas and things like that? So we've been asked about those use cases. We're starting to dabble in opioids, which I still think is a truly sad epidemic we have here. It hits close to home. I'm from a coal mining town where that is a lot of those issues out there. So we keep getting to explore these new and interesting use cases because cannabis is a very difficult industry, and we've done a lot of work that I'm really proud of. And so people see that and they're like, wait a minute, if you can do that here, can you help us with insert X problem? And so it's kind of cool, the people and the things that we've gotten exposed to and gotten to take part of because of that little protected petri dish that NCS never would have existed otherwise. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened. None of the companies that you guys see every day would have if, when this industry was starting out, it wouldn't have been protected and allowed to establish.
And I have to imagine that as regulators, between myself and Erik, if we had some of those monster companies knocking at our door, we would be going through a procurement process with a bid, and we'd select a vendor, and that would be it. We would get a product and move on. What I've found in cannabis in particular as a regulator is those smaller companies that do come and knock on your door and have an idea, or and I'll just single NCS out as an example, which is the ability to brainstorm alongside the regulator and say what it's sort of the problem solving and the creativity and the why don't we try this. I think you get that flexibility and that ingenuity because essentially this is all one big experiment. Yes, sure, that's fair, but it's also the sort of the human aspect of this is a puzzle, let's solve it. And you don't always get that with some of the larger companies that they just don't have that flexibility. They're not made that way. And that's not a knock on them outside of just you get what you get. And I think with a company like NCS and others that have sort of embarked on cannabis as an industry to perform in, I think you get that creativity and that ingenuity.
Was there a question there, Shawn?
Yeah. So that's the next 5-10 years. What the next 15 to 20 years? Anything? I guess one question I would ask, and it's sort of an open-ended, but it's just a curiosity of mine, is you work with a lot of states. You work with a lot of industry. You work sort of across a different spectrum. As you sit down with these regulators, is there a particular data set or element that you're like, if you are a regulator, just please collect this? Like, is there one thing you could point to, or maybe if not that easy, like a handful of things that don't occur naturally to either Erik or I because we're still learning, but is there a data set or piece that you think just collect this and you'll not so much you'll be okay, but it would be immensely powerful, helpful, meaningful?
I would actually say, as opposed to collecting it, it'd be more leveraging it, because I still think that there are mountains of untouched data. And in defense of the regulators and the tracking systems, the greatest strength of a tracking system is the amount of data it collects, the insanely granular detail. I moved a plant to this room. It grew a bud, so I changed it. So the greatest strength is that level of detail, but that's also its biggest weakness. When you start getting hundreds or even thousands of licenses that are all doing activity, it just becomes so much data that it actually causes a paralysis. So I wouldn't advocate for collecting more. I would advocate for leveraging what you have, whether it's in-house, whether it's just playing with it, getting comfortable with it. I'm always obviously happy to help, but I think that figuring out the data interactions, I personally think, is the coolest and nerdiest thing that is not being done right now. And it's something that we rolled out. It's called a risk index. And instead of just saying this is a statistical anomaly, it's a logic engine. And so there's aggravating and mitigating factors that look at all of these different events and say, okay, well, that made that less severe. This made this more severe, things like that, into where we're applying a layer of logic, not just math, not just fancy analytics, to create this better understanding. And it's so truly fascinating that we have models that can tell an actual story instead of just saying that was out of bounds. And I think that is truly fascinating. I think that being able to do more of that is where this industry and others are headed.
Cool. I mean, we could. You didn't like. Very cool.
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 That's the punctuation you were looking for. Was yeah.
I like that.
Well, I'm sure we could continue to have this conversation, go on and on and on. It's fascinating, the tool that you've built, how it works, and the value that it can bring to a whole bunch of different groups, not only cannabis regulators, but it sounds like management at your local Ruby Tuesdays. And I will say I had a flashback when you brought up the Aloha system. I was 4 years at Bugaboo Creek Steakhouse in Bangor, Maine through college. I was Haas.
Explains the health violations. Yeah.
I was very familiar with the Aloha systems, but no, seriously, Adam, thank you for coming on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for having this conversation with us, giving us a little bit of your background, the work that you're doing at NCS. I think this is the type of conversation that Shawn and I were looking to have when we set out doing this podcast, and hearing from all the different voices in the cannabis ecosystem, the cannabis space, all the different things that they're working on, different experiences. So I know we know each other well, but thank you for your time, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. Shawn, you got anything else?
Just to sort of pile on that last point, I think, Adam, my personal thanks for joining us. And anyone that's listening, whether it be a regulator or an operator, there are countless issues that you experience as a regulator or an operator that need solutions. And the data itself can lead to at least a diagnosis that can then bring forth solutions. So think about the issues that we hear about constantly around ownership, control, labs, all these things. There's a bunch of data that can be learned from if organized and presented and utilized. And so if you are a regulator, obviously, think about reaching out to Adam. If you're an operator, recommend this to your regulator. Say, have you had a conversation? Because as I said earlier, good operators want enforcement. They're going to play by the rules. They want to ensure that the competition does too. So I think that's why, Erik, to your point, we try to bring folks on to our podcast, one, introduce our audience to them, but also to sort of peel the curtain back a little bit and give folks insight into the intelligence that is being put to play in a lot of states right now, to the credit of those states that are looking to just learn objectively and then bring, if necessary, bring cases that are reliable and provable. So,
well said.
Yeah, there's no question there. Sorry. Cool. Yeah. All right. What are we doing? Are we wrapping up here, Erik? Is that what you pulling the hook on me?
Oh, we can wrap up, or we can do trivia. Adam, do you want to stay for a quick trivia question, or I know your time is valuable. Yeah, let's rock and roll. Let's wrap it up with trivia, the three of us.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? We can start with the fact that I Googled a trivia question while we were just recording that conversation. So
that explains the cool at the end. Cool. I wasn't paying attention to anything you just said, Adam. But thanks for coming on.
All right, Adam. So our listeners know this, but most episodes we do trivia at the very end. It's I ask Shawn a question, Shawn asks me. I think in theory we're keeping track, but I don't think either one of us could tell you what the score is. Shawn would say he was up.
We can run tape.
Shawn would say he's up. I would call Shawn a liar. But you can, yeah, you can jump in and you can answer. There'll be like a little package deal here for answering. So I'm going to start off because my on par
question's still loading.
My question, while it's finished being loaded, it's a terrible question. It's not episode relevant, and I'm going to guess that the two of you will get this pretty quickly. And if not, you'll be very close to getting it. So the question is, in what year did Canada legalize cannabis?
$18?
Shawn?
Yeah, I'm thinking I would take the under on 18.
I was going back and forth on 16 or 18. But
Yeah, all right, then I'll go 16.
2018. Nicely done,
Son of a
Adam
bitch.
Crabtree. No, it was still pretty close.
Nerd.
I tried so hard to find I tried so hard to find a relevant question. I just could not come up with a good one.
you
I've
should have
got
told
one.
me. Leanne does weekly trivia for our newsletter.
Yeah, there you go.
Could have sent those to you.
Or like and subscribe. So my question actually is relevant because I planned, which is this is just there's no A, B, C, D or true false. It's so according to metric. So keep in mind this is metric as far as the universe. How many supply chain events? So think packages, transports, the tracked actions itself have been recorded in the metric system across U.S. regulated markets. So this is unique events in
Specific
metric.
to metric.
Yep. So again, this is according to metric in metric system
Is there a time period or just in general, just in
across
total?
U.S. regulated markets. So
You define like plants grown,
this is a
sales
true or
made.
false. Like this is a trivia question, sir. This is it's right
Can I
on your
say-
card.
Wait,
100
you're surprised the data guy is trying to understand the parameters of the question?
If I just say hundreds of millions, would that be close enough?
No, you're way off. I would say it's probably close to $1 billion at this point, depending on how you define transactions.
Yes, so it's 5 billion.
I mean, if we're go, I would still give hundreds of millions a correct answer for just being a lot. It's better than saying a lot. I actually put a number to it, hundreds of millions.
Yeah, I was looking for a time frame itself. I'm not finding a time frame in the. I guess maybe the article I was reading said since 2011 metric has grown, so that might be their time frame. But regardless, it's 5 billion supply chain events across U.S. systems. So, which I think just speaks to, as Adam was alluding to, just the volume of information that is out there that can be utilized, but also the intelligence that regulators have at their fingertips as far as what to track and what to monitor. But that also speaks to, I think, sometimes the burden that regulators have of making sense of all that information too. So just because you have access to it doesn't mean that you can, again, it's that haystack. And sometimes you're looking for the needle. And that's where folks like Adam and his team come in. So
Cool.
you want to take us out of here, Erik, or?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for listening, everybody. And again, thanking our guest, Adam Crabtree from NCS Analytics. I echo what Shawn said. If you're in the space, if you have questions, if you're interested in exploring, reach out to him and his team. They're absolutely fabulous, and they've been working with state governments for a long time. Shawn, always good to see you. I will note before we leave for the episode that it is with a heavy heart that we circle back to our conversation around the New England Patriots last week.
Yeah.
We did lose the Super Bowl. We're well ahead of the curve. I may have been wrong on my predictions, but I'm right to say that we will be back. So all of New England,
Bold.
yeah,
Very
all of
bold.
New England, it was a hell of a ride. As always, steal Shawn's line. Please like and subscribe.
That's right.
Continue to send us in suggestions for guests that we should have on, conversations to have. But other than that, Adam, thank you. Shawn, always great to see you. Love you, buddy.
Yeah. Well, thanks, everybody. And we will be back soon enough with more exciting episodes. So, as Erik said, like, subscribe.
Cool.
Bye, everybody.
The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid.